Welcome, Chosen X. You open your eyes to a world that remembers your name, a horizon leaning toward the shape of you. In the quiet hour when doubt things and old maps dissolve, you stand at a threshold that refuses the old clauses of defeat. Nothing about this arrival is accidental. Every surrender you once labeled failure braided into durable resolve, and the weight you bore has become exacting gravity that centers rather than crushes. The first thing you notice is how light answers you. It does not merely fall, it gathers where your presence chooses to rest. Sounds sharpen as if your name were a tuning fork setting the ear. Memory shifts from trap to ledger, and you collect shards of history like deliberate craftsmen, arranging each broken piece into a strong vessel that holds both scar and seed. Nights of loss served as rigorous apprenticeships. As you move, landscapes reciprocate. Rivers find new tilts toward your feet, offering currents that hold ancestral patterns. Stones that once watched you pass now resonate with the cadence of your steps. Trees lower their arms in a patient nod, and wind, once a scatterer of words, turns into courier, carrying exact signals to distant places. This is not mere recovery, it is initiation into a domain where unseen laws record possibility. A steady hum lives beneath your sternum, a frequency that turns choices into craft and fear into disciplined courage. Threats that once threatened dissolution have become guideposts along a remade route. You exercise patience that cuts rather than waits, a vigilance that asks for agreements instead of permission. When you speak, phrases arrive as measured gifts. When you act, trajectories trace intent with economical grace. Those who once reduced you to a margin sense the shift and recoil, as if certainty had been recalibrated. Their comforts grow brittle, their maps lose detail. They seek instructions and find weather and currents governed by the motion of your pulse. This change is not vengeance, it is a law of restoration, an accounting that restores balance through steady reclamation rather than spectacle. You keep an inner archive of rituals no one taught, daily disciplines and quiet practices that read like liturgy. You move through rooms as a subtle correction, your presence shifting narratives that tried to contain you. Where doubt was planted, you cultivated clarity, tending it with rigorous care and a tenderness toward the fractures that shaped you. An ethic of ascent guides you, refusing bitterness as a compass. Dreams arrive as couriers, not mirrors, delivering symbols that demand translation. Those nocturnal guides hand you coordinates and thresholds. You learn to distinguish light that promises from light that demands a price. With this discernment you choose gates that protect your center while extending influence where it matters. This chapter closes with a single discovery: authority need not raise its voice to be absolute. Its sovereignty often lives in habit, in the quiet accumulation of precise acts that compound into unmistakable consequence. You rise without pageantry, a calibrated instrument tempered by trials and the careful tending of a life that resisted erasure. Poised at the cusp of the next movement, you carry a directive intimate and expansive, hold strictness toward truth and a generosity that fashions new covenants. The world rearranges itself around your intention. Step forward as into a composition waiting for your cadence, because in this hour you learn the life that answers to you is aligning long before you noticed. Beyond this threshold, you will discover alliances that arrive like discreet tides, companions whose timing is measured and whose presence expands your reach. These bonds are not accidents, they are accords written in quiet rooms and in maps of stars, and they will teach you how to hold power without erasing tenderness. Move with intention, and let the work of revival be also the work of keeping faith. Begin. You return to the scene with a stillness that unsettles weather and memory alike. The corridors that once echoed with polite dismissals now feel like maps you can read from the inside, each door labeled by its small betrayals. You move without theatrics, gathering what was hidden behind casual smiles and staged concern. Where silence was cultivated as a tool their confidence lay, you find seams of truth stitched into ordinary conversations. Paper trails, coded gestures, fragments of meetings become a lattice that points toward motive and omission. At night, when ordinary sleep loosens its grip, a presence visits you between breaths. Not a voice demanding allegiance, but a pattern of images that lands like a compass on the palm of your awareness. A lantern swayed over an empty dock. A ring of stones reclaimed by moss. A single name folded into a childlike sketch. These tokens do not speak in full sentences, they offer edges and anchors for your understanding. You accept them as coordinates and begin the exact work of translation. As you trace the route they intended to bury, you notice how mundane objects gather testimony. A coffee cup preserves a smear shaped like a signature. A ledger contains a misplaced date that aligns with an unexplained absence. A photograph, cropped deliberately, hides in its margin a face they assumed they had erased. Your method is quiet and precise. You do not shout accusations, you arrange facts like stones across a stream and watch currents reveal the line they carve. People who once navigated your days as comfortable fixtures now hurry with furtive steps. They hunt for explanations in weather shifts, in rumors, in the gossip that flutters like restless birds. Their attempts to rewrite timelines feel clumsy in your hands because you learn to make truth function as a tool. You translate hushed confessions into a ledger of intent and consequence. Each revelation loosens a knot in the social web they thought secure. Knowledge brings clarity and risk in equal measure. Information sharpens the world into choices and obligations. You weigh what to expose and when, mindful that certain disclosures will topple not merely egos but entire arrangements. Precision wins over spectacle because your aim is repair, not theatrics. You craft a summons that reads as both legal notice and ceremonial calling. It will demand accounting in rooms of law and conscience. Those who offered perfunctory sympathy with fixed smiles will no longer find you adrift. You present evidence with the calm of someone who has practiced restraint across seasons. Witnesses who feared retaliation begin to find courage in the steadiness of your demeanor. Your dossier accumulates momentum instead of noise. It reaches desks where decisions are made without melodrama. It lands as a necessary burden that cannot be disregarded. Much still lies buried beneath layers constructed by people who believed time would be their ally. You continue to excavate, knowing revelation is a patient labor that requires both endurance and discretion. Meanwhile, you cultivate allies whose gaze learns to look without being instructed. They are skilled hands that return what was taken, measuring loss with a tenderness that promises more than vengeance. When the first summons is received, an old silence fractures. Conversations shift tone. Doors that once closed quietly now open with a reluctant vigilance. People begin to recollect details they had edited away. The truth does not erupt like a storm, it arrives as an inevitable tide. You stand at the leading edge, neither triumphant nor vindictive, simply effective, and the world registers the competence of a verdict carried without fury. Corridors rearrange and old confidences falter as companions summoned by memory arrive with skill and patience. You do not hurry, you fold them into a calm, decisive blueprint and purpose. Night opens like a silent vault as your companion materializes from the city's periphery, bearing nothing ostentatious yet carrying maps of passageways forgotten by official histories. You sense someone who moved through thresholds without announcing a footprint, whose presence makes small truths tilt toward clarity. Together you assemble methods that feel more like devotions than plans, disciplined gestures that train the world to answer differently. Where others stage declarations, you craft protocols that bind opportunity to responsibility, and the work builds quietly, cumulatively. Training takes place in unlit rooms and on long stretches of empty pavement, where you practice phrases that open doors and learn silences that shield confidence. Meetings happen in cafes that close early and in basements warmed by hands who have long memories. Conversations become an economy of favors and promises kept without spectacle. Your ally treats timing as a skill and patience as a refined instrument, revealing how restraint can unmake arrogance. Rumors of your coordination ripple outward the way a pebble pushes concentric circles across still water. The people who once felt immovable begin to notice small tremors, an endorsement withheld, a contract delayed, an obligation that unravels at a key hinge. Attempts to retaliate misfire because your responses adapt, because your strategy anticipates rather than merely reacts. You prefer to reroute power, not simply shatter it, believing structural correction endures longer than theatrical collapse. Sometimes your ally shares knowledge that reads like an archive of overlooked practices, rituals, and observational methods salvaged from displaced communities. You learn to use these resources practically, to restore records erased by negligence, to amplify voices smothered by quiet coercion, to craft legal maneuvers that are precise and humane. Those lessons convert historical insight into modern instruments of repair, and each reclaimed ledger entry becomes a small act of collective justice. Community becomes both terrain and teacher. You are guided to kitchens where neighbors exchange food and information, to clinics that stitch wounds and official papers, to houses where elders catalog deeds by memory. These sites teach you that power also resides in care, and rebuilding livelihoods becomes an arm of your strategy. Repair, you learn, makes resistance sustainable by reconstructing what injustice had systematically worn thin. Opponents respond with increasingly frantic narratives, their campaigns amplifying desperation rather than effectiveness. Fabricated scandals thin under scrutiny. Their attempts to discredit your allies reveal more about their fear than any true vulnerability of yours. Meanwhile, your coalition grows in competence and composure, drawing strength from incremental, unquestionable wins that change the field of play without drama. The alliance moves like a slow tide around anchored stones, patient and inevitable. You navigate moral complexities with an ethic formed by listening and an inclination to repair rather than merely repel. Tactical temperance becomes the architecture of durable change because what survives must withstand closer inspection and longer seasons. This phase of work is invisible to those hungry for spectacle. It consists of modest disciplined acts performed with near ritual exactness. You hoard competence not for vanity but for consequence, and your moderation communicates a steady authority that unsettles adversaries and reassures collaborators. As the landscape shifts, you feel a readiness hum beneath ordinary routines, a quiet current suggesting a broader rebalancing is approaching, and you prepare to lead that movement into the next phase. You catalog these accomplishments in a ledger of small truths and let them accumulate like low flames that warm a vast hall. Soon the air will demand more than repair, it will require a decisive summons. Begin. You feel a steady current settle into the backbone of your days, a companion pulse that marks time like a lodestar. In private moments the air answers gestures you barely intend, subtle alignments that rearrange small elements of proximity and weather. Where you once accommodated the world, you now invite it to comply with principles learned in hardship. This is not a spectacle of sudden dominion but a methodical reclaiming of authority grown from patient living. Ancestors arrive as tendencies rather than apparitions. Their counsel shows in habits you inherit without instruction. A bowl set for strangers becomes a pledge, a song half-hummed maps a memory. You perform small acts that ripple wider than their scale. These rituals are practical interventions, governance practiced in kitchens and doorways rather than in halls that sought to exclude you. The elements answer as collaborators. Soil offers firmness you can leverage, air carries messages you decode, fire sharpens resolve without consuming source, water reveals channels where influence flows. You learn to listen and arrange steps according to their counsel. You steward momentum like someone tending a communal field, allocating care where it yields lasting harvest rather than transient spectacle. Your power acquires texture. It is not merely force but the capacity to repair structures designed to fracture. Where systems profited from holes you patch and turn leaks into reservoirs. You set processes that privilege repair and accountability, persuading institutions to account with the same routine ancestors used to hold communities together. Those who had assumed your erasure notice a shift they cannot decode. Their networks, reliant on predictable movement and silence, find patterns interrupted. Contracts stall not from drama but because careful people refuse to be silent witnesses. Advantages they relied upon eroded under steady pressure of restored practice and joint testimony. Your presence reframes risk. Where once retaliation felt imminent, you build safeguards through communal competence and legal precision. Allies forged in quiet rooms hold evidence with patience and refusal to inflame. This disciplined reserve converts exposure into lasting reform rather than transient triumph. Natural signs become instruments of assessment. A sudden frost can indicate brittle alliance, persistent fog reveals obfuscation, and a swollen spring might mark recovery of property or story. You read these phenomena not as superstition but as ecological indicators that enrich strategy. That attunement gives you anticipatory advantage because you move with seasons rather than against them. In private you bind intention to practice. You keep ledgers that are lists of service, small entries that accumulate into public consequence. You repair relationships that were tactical casualties and restore trusts treated as expendable. Your work is slow and it confounds opponents because it outlasts schemes designed for immediate gain. By the time influence shows in public measures, your opponents feel less like targets and more like relics of a system that no longer feeds them. Their strategies wobble because incentives that sustain their habits have been altered. What they sold as stability looks fragile against steady routines you installed. The culmination of this phase is not a thunderclap but a settling. You anchor practices that translate private resilience into public resilience. You return power not solely to yourself but to communities starved of care. In that redistribution you become less of an individual and more of a living precedent. Your readiness is a quiet authority that reshapes habits and secures dignity for communities beyond any single event. As the earth receives this new ordering, you prepare for the next movement. Elements rest and stand ready. Kinship consolidates around service. The stage is set for a decisive step that will enshrine the principles you embody. Begin. You stand at the final threshold with a steadiness that reframes the idea of force. Your work was methodical, assembling systems that mend rather than punish. Neighborhood rhythms you restored make life less brittle as prosperity outlasts political whims. Those who relied on predictable fractures notice foundations softening under sustained attention. You made accountability routine, changing incentives across networks. You create processes that reward repair and prevent the easy erasure of records and lives. When people bring claims, they find procedures that treat them with dignity and produce restoration rather than headlines. This insistence on mechanics of care reshapes what power can mean in daily practice. Opponents respond with last efforts that resemble panic more than strategy. Their schemes fail because communities have redundancy and legal precision now. Where coercion once worked, steady public forms and neighbor-based oversight make reversal costly and unlikely. You do not gloat at their missteps. Instead you keep building, making what was once fragile durable. There is also a ceremony to this work because repair requires witnesses. You convene meetings that are less about declaration and more about listening. Elders speak to facts that records missed. Artists make things that hold memory in ways spreadsheets cannot. These acts turn private harms into public knowledge that resists forgetting. Power in your hands feels like stewardship. It asks for small, consistent acts that outlast headlines. You refuse spectacle and devote yourself to craft. Practitioners trained in those rooms carry forward the ethos of repair, teaching neighbors how to preserve records, tend clinics, and mentor those recovering from harm. The change becomes social technology, embedded and transmissible. As seasons pass, the old network of deniability erodes. People who imagine safety in your absence begin to check one another in public and private. Institutions adapt to new expectations because they must or because they see the moral logic of reform. The result is not a dramatic collapse but a field reordered toward care and accountability. In the quiet after these shifts you notice a new frequency moving through streets and workplaces. Those previously silenced form organizations that protect gains and expand access. They teach the next generation how to guard truth with everyday practice. The movement you catalyzed becomes resilient because it is distributed in mundane as well as principled and visionary. On a morning lit like glass you stand with people who coded new ordinances and open resources that matter. The measures you sign are practical and enforceable. They will be maintained by committees, budgets, and volunteers trained to watch for erasure and to respond early. This is governance as steady repair, not governance as spectacle. Then a transmission arrives, centered on your screen as if the technology itself obeys the new orientation of life. A single frame holds a continuation of the work, a spoken lesson and a map of rituals to incorporate into daily governance and care. The video will illustrate small practices that expand the protections you established and that keep communities alive across seasons. When that frame appears, accept the invitation to continue the lesson, subscribe and enable notifications today. This step is not an addendum. It is a practical commitment to stay connected to guidance that will arrive at intervals as realities shift. Subscribing keeps the channel open and notifications allow the lessons to reach you in real time so you can act when the moment demands. Your role now is to steward what is restorable and to guard it with generosity. You are not a solitary avenger but a keeper of processes that make society less fragile. The work continues beyond this text and the next steps await behind the image that will fill the center of your screen. Watch it and remain present as the teaching continues there.